I think we'll skip that, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss informally during the conference. Along the way, you should feel free to interrupt, ask questions. We may try to get a little bit of sort of question and answer at the end as well, although I don't know how good I am at keeping time. But please don't hesitate to, along the way, ask questions. Sometimes I'm not as clear as I would have liked. Yes?
Can we get the slides afterwards? Or do we
Can you get the slides? You can get the slides if you want the slides. Yeah. There's a lot of material I'd like to cover today, and here's a brief overview. I hope we'll get through all of it, or at least most of it. But should we not get all the way, then I guess I'll be happier if we have good discussions along the way. I'll start out with just a few facts by way of introduction, and also outline briefly what I see as some of the standard explanations for what has been happening. I won't go into any great detail, but I think it is important to know both what the standard explanations are and also why those are the standard. And that will sort of set the stage for my attempt to present a couple of alternatives. And shamelessly, I'm talking about work that I've been doing. That does not necessarily mean that's the most interesting on this topic, but it's what I know about. So that's what you'll hear. And I'll talk about two different alternative perspectives. They're not mutually exclusive, but to make life easy for yourself, it's sometimes good to look at things in isolation if you can, rather than mix it all together. The first is what I've called power-biased technical change. And the second is the effects of having mismatch or induced overeducation in the labor market, which, in my view, can lead to comparative statics that are somewhat different from what you'd usually expect. Then I will try to say a little bit about macro effects, and that's going to be very sketchy. And again, there is actually a big literature on that, and I will be talking mainly about one very small element, and it's just to illustrate that there are these possible connections. It's not meant to be in any way a kind of exhaustive story about what the macro implications might be. And then I hope that we can have at the end some time to look a little bit at international evidence, which I think is important also if one wants to discuss the possibility of maybe doing something about the increase in inequality, than just being aware that there is a diversity of experience out there is helpful. So that's the plan. And, whoops, is that right? Yeah, that's just a bit of literature, but you have that, so I won't talk about that. Aside from what I have sent to you and my own papers, I've listed here three, I think, great sources just of data and of insight into what's happening in the US economy. Every year there's the EPI publication, State of Working America, which I think is a wonderful source of information on all things related to wages and employment, incomes. There's the wonderful Piketty and Sayers database, which has a lot of now also international information, and even the OECD and I guess other sort of more mainstream people have now become interested in it, and the OECD has a couple of publications that list international evidence. So just I'll give you the slides, as you said, if you want afterwards, so you don't have to copy it down. Okay. Introduction. Income distribution. If you come from a heterodox sort of critical background, when people say income distribution, they often immediately think of the functional distribution of income. And here is a slide that shows you the profit share, US corporate business. And if you look at that, one can debate whether this is completely accurate, because some of what has been paid out to CEOs as wages maybe really should be included in that. So one can debate whether maybe it should bend up more than it does in this graph. But I think it's still relatively clear that it's not in terms of the profit share that the real action has been. So when we talk about this dramatic increase in inequality, what most people mainly have in mind, I think rightly, is that there has been in the earnings distribution this incredibly increase in inequality. There has also been, and that's what we see in this slide, there's also been previously a reduction in inequality. If you go back in the 1940s, there was this steep drop in inequality. The slide here shows the income share of the top 10% in the US. You could show other similar graphs. It doesn't really matter. If you take the top 1%, it's even more dramatic. But what you see is this great compression. And then starting in the late 70s, you see it going back up to levels that are similar to what you saw back in the 20s and 30s. You can view that you can see other parts of this pattern. One of them is that wages are a very significant proportion of even the income of the top. This is the two slides with the top 1% and the top 0.1% of income earners, and you see how the share of wages in their income has increased dramatically. So there's something about the earnings side that has been critical. From State of Working America, many of the slides, the empirical slides here, will be taken from that source. You see the dramatic kink. You see how up until the mid-1970s, you have hourly earnings rising. This is for non-supervisory workers, and then you have this kink, and it's been flat ever since. If you break it up, and here is the cumulative change in real hourly wages. This is for men, and this is by wage percentile. And you see at the top end, you've had dramatic wage increases. And if you go down at the bottom end, the poorest parts of the population of men have actually seen declining real income since 1979. You see the same pattern for women. The only difference is that women have caught up a little bit, so the whole thing is shifted up. But you still see that it's the rich who have had the high increases in income. College wage premium, another element that captures some of this, both for men and women. If you're college educated, the premium over what you'd get if you didn't have a college degree has been increasing relatively steadily from the late 70s. And then here is a slide that says a little bit about, is this something, in a sense, we should worry about? One could have argued, or some people have suggested sometimes, that taking a sort of income distribution at a point in time shouldn't really matter because there's a lot of mobility and people move around all the time, so that's not relevant. But what we do see here, this is a measure of the elasticity between parental income and son's earnings. And as that elasticity increases, that means you get less mobility. If you're born to a rich family, you tend to be rich as well. And you see how that elasticity has been increasing steadily. So this myth about high mobility and we shouldn't really worry about it is not really justified. Okay, these were some stylized facts. You could present tons of these, but just to set the stage. Now, there are a couple of, probably if one asked sort of in general people, what do they think explain it? I think there are two sort of fairly obvious explanations that would come up. And one would be institutional changes like neoliberal society now. You see decline in unions, you've seen declining minimum wage, you've seen deregulation, you've seen all these different institutional changes. And that might seem to be an obvious place to start. You could also say globalization. That comes up perhaps even more. If you talk to people, globalization, you have increased trade, you have capital mobility, and that has been part of what's been going on, and that may have been putting pressure on wages. Now, just to illustrate, here is the trade figure that shows that, yes, indeed, the US, a lot of this is US data. We will get some international data towards the end, but US has become a more open economy, and you see the import share increasing and the import share also from less developed countries. has gone up dramatically. Some of these changes in institutions here, you have the real value of the minimum wage, which is now much lower than it was back in 1967. This is the absolute real value of the minimum wage, which has been going down like that. If you try to scale it by looking at the minimum wage relative to economy-wide productivity, then it's even more dramatic. So if you think of that relative to what would be the average potential income, then the decline gets even more steep. And here's union coverage, declining as we know. You could also look at how militant are unions. Here's an indicator perhaps of that, or our workers, how many people are engaged in work stoppages. Again, over the period from 1947, you see the decline in that. And finally here we have taxes. This is the average tax rates for the highest income taxpayers. So this is for the top 0.1% and the top 0.01%. So this is the very top. And you see how these average tax rates have come down. As you looked at marginal rates, they would have been even higher. So you have this whole range of institutional changes that would seem obvious explanations. You have the globalization that would seem an obvious factor. Why is it that many mainstream people think this is not the explanation? I will argue that, in fact, institutional changes are very important. But it's important before making that argument to perhaps be clear why it's even an argument that anybody would dispute. And the problem is that if you look at what's been happening to wage inequality, then yes, wage inequality has increased. But you have also seen movements in relative employment. An example of that here, you have the college-high school wage gap, and you have the relative supply of college and high school workers. And you see them moving together. Now, why is that interesting or puzzling? Well, it's interesting or puzzling because that suggests that maybe the change has been on the demand side of the labor market. If it had been the case that we had just some institutional change exogenously reducing the wage of one group of workers and raising the wage of another, then you would expect profit-maximizing firms to say, we're going to now employ more of the workers who have become cheap and fewer of the ones who have become expensive. What you see is that you have this shift in the supply of the two groups, and it's not the case that the highly skilled, the college-educated have high unemployment. And it's not the case that you have everybody screaming for the unskilled, the low-skilled, low-paid workers. So seemingly you've had both employment patterns and wage patterns moving the same direction, and that, the argument is, suggests that you have skill-biased technical change. There must have been a shift on the demand side. Something has happened to technology so that firms now want to employ more workers more high-skilled workers at given wage rates, or you'd get the rise in the wage of the high-skilled workers to dampen the demand. Does that make sense? So essentially, there's here a kind of Tina argument. Tina from Margaret Thatcher, who back in the 1980s told the UK, there is no alternative to my policies. I mean, you can talk about institutional changes, but they are not the exogenous forces. The institutional changes, the fall in the minimum wage, has been allowed to happen. Why has it been allowed to happen? Well, because otherwise we would have seen high unemployment among the low-skilled workers. So that is endogenous. It's the fundamental market processes that lie behind it. So the question in some sense is is this Tina argument valid? Is it the case that institutional changes have only been sort of proximate parts of the story, but the real underlying process is one of demand-side changes associated with skill bias technical change? The first perspective I want to suggest to you, the first way of trying to challenge this Tina argument is to say, okay, let's for the time being focus on technology. Let's accept that we have had big changes in technology over the last, well, not just the last 30, 40 years. In fact, we've had that way back. If you look at technical change and changes in income, in labor productivity, they were higher during the 50s and 60s than they have been since the 70s. But we have also had significant technical changes during this period. But the question is, are these technical changes, are they all like skill bias? Is that the right category? Or are there technical changes that are of a very different nature? And to illustrate that, here's something that you cannot read. But it is a copy of something that I found in my local Amherst, Massachusetts newspaper at the time when I was working on this with my co-author, who's Fred Guy. I should mention Fred Guy. Fred Guy has had many of the real ideas. I've just been a technical guy to some extent. But while Fred and I were working on this, I came across this in the classified section of the what's it called, the Hampshire Gazette. What it is this ad for a Fleet black box, this little thing that you can put into a truck, and when you put it into that, then you can monitor what's going on. Well, this is hard to read, but I actually went to their website, the manufacturer's website afterwards, and looked up, what is this thing? And this is what they explain. It is like being able to sit next to every one of your drivers every second they drive. You can check whether they drive in a safe and a responsible manner, how fast they're going right now, what gear they're in. You can even, it said in the ad that you couldn't read, you can even check the sound level, what music they're listening to. Right? Now, why the heck would anybody spend good money on putting that in a truck? Right? It's not skill bias. It doesn't make it any easier to drive the bloody truck. Right? Why would you spend money on that? Well, it enables you to sit next to every one of your drivers every second they drive. So now you send off your trucks and they go across the US, and before you would know very little about what they were doing. They might be mishandling the truck, they might take breaks, they might sort of do a little detour, they might blame it on bad weather, they might... Now they can't do it. What we have here is an example, and it seems to me a very pure example of what we call power bias technical change. Before, the truck driver had some power, the power to inflict some kind of damage on the owner of the truck. If the truck driver did not feel well treated, there was a way of responding. If you don't pay me well, treat me well, I won't work well. Right? And of course, the owners might realize that, and they would pay what in the literature is an efficiency wage, right? You cannot monitor perfectly what's going on, so you may want to pay workers well so that if you catch them doing something bad, you can fire them. And that threat, the fact that they have this cost of job loss, is what makes them perform. Right? All of a sudden, you're now able to monitor what your truck drivers are doing. And that means you don't have to pay them the same kind of premium. Is that an isolated incident? No, I don't think so. Here's another example. This is from Business Week, and this is again at the time when we were first working on this. They had a special report on future of tech, and where they're talking about how computer technology is being used. And here's an example from the retail sector. where you have now the software that analyzes cashier transactions for signs of fraud. Right? Here's what they explain, that no part of a store churns up more data than cash registers. And this is where employee theft is most likely to pop up. And now with the press of a button, managers can highlight irregular register transactions, etc., etc. It's part of a bigger story in the retail sector, but again, it has this improved monitoring element, this power bias technical change element. Think of call centers. You call somewhere, and you're told that this call may be monitored for quality control, right? Why is that? I mean, I think there are numerous of these examples of how technology, improved technology, has shifted the balance of power, in particular in some relatively routine kind of jobs, in ways that have nothing to do with skill, but may still have an important impact on wage setting. And that's what this slide says. We have the new information and communication technology, and that improves firms' ability to monitor what the workers do and monitor the state of nature in which they act. What you should be doing depends on what the situation is, how many customers are in the supermarket. And they can manage information flows. What this would give you, if you wanted to try to formalize this, move beyond the sort of anecdotes here, and try to set up a small model and say, hey, what is the logic of this? Now assume that this takes place. What is the logic of it? Then the way you would want to formalize it is that you want to now make the risk of getting fired, making that more sensitive to how hard you work. It's not the absolute sort of, what is my percentage risk of being fired next year? It's not that absolute number. It is how sensitive is it to precisely what I'm doing. Right? You can monitor more finely now, and that means that sensitivity has increased. How can we do this? I don't know. I know that some of you don't maybe like a lot of math, or at least I'd expect you don't like a lot of math. But I do want to just put some of these equations on the board, and I'll talk about what they mean, so don't worry about too much the details. So if you want to now use this setting to explain increasing inequality among workers, then clearly you need to have at least two groups of workers, right? So the simplest possible model would have two types of workers. And to make life easy, I'll assume that there's complete symmetry. There's the same number of each of these workers, and everything in the model will be symmetric, except for one group of workers. Now you get an increased ability to monitor, right? So there'll be, in that sense, high power and low power. The low power lose power because they can now be monitored better. That's what I want to examine. I'll assume that there's no mismatch. I think I say this mainly here because the next sort of big item on the agenda will be precisely when we have mismatch. There's no mismatch here. So we have the one group of workers that have a particular type of job, and the other group, well-defined workers that take the other job. Was that a question?
The question was exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
So it's two production processes. It's not two types of worker doing the same thing.
It's one production function. You have one output, but you have two groups of workers. So these are different jobs, and there's one group of workers that can do one job, and the other group can do the other. Does that? Yeah. Yeah, so production function is down here, and you see that I have included not just the ends, which was the number of high and low power workers, but also ease, that's the effort. Now you can monitor, and workers will maybe speed up effort, and they would certainly provide effort or work in a way so that maybe they don't risk being fired. Right? That's the whole essence of this type of model. Workers have to decide how much effort to provide, and if you look at what I call the objective function, what you see in square brackets is the difference between the wage and then the disutility of working, which depends on how hard you work, and then there's the fallback position. So if you didn't need to worry about being fired, you would just put your effort low, you'd sit and play cards in the corner, and you would get a high utility flow. What prevents you from doing that is that you have multiplied onto that expression, you have this function that depends on E. And that's, in some loose way, is how long can you expect to be working for this firm before you get fired or lose your job for other reasons. You may move to Seattle to marry somebody, right? And that P function depends on E, because if you don't work hard, if you sit and play cards, you'll probably get fired. So you will lose that job rent, that extra premium you get. So you have these two effects of effort. It costs you in terms of current utility flow, but it means you can probably keep it longer. And you're trying to balance those two. P is continuous here. You can differentiate it, and I will be doing so. Yeah. Then you have some first-order conditions, and you can derive from that what weight setting will have to satisfy, and you can impose symmetry conditions now. Everybody, all firms pay the same wage, et cetera, and then you come to an equilibrium. You can solve now for the endogenous variables, which would be our wages for the two groups of workers, how much effort they provide, how hard they work, and what's the employment. You can solve for that as a function of the various parameters, and in particular as a function of how elastic is this firing function with respect to effort. That's what I said. If you can monitor well, then if you start playing just a little bit of cards once in a while, you get fired, right? So it's the sensitivity, it's the elasticity of that P function that matters. And that is what I have labeled mu. You probably didn't catch that, but that was how I defined mu along the way. You can look at the slides later, but this is the intuition. Okay. So, just to sum up, the improved monitoring of one group corresponds to an increase in the sensitivity of the firing risk. And formally, that's the elasticity of this P function that has gone up. Oh, here it is. Here is my P function. It's a hideous, even if you make simple functional forms, it's still quite hideous and nonlinear. So, solving it explicitly is, at least I couldn't do it. I think it's difficult. I think it's maybe impossible. But you can easily simulate it. And that's what we did here. And we did a number of different versions with different parameter values. And here is one that sort of captures what we're after. We could get that for a range of parameters. It's not super special. But I should tell you, it doesn't happen automatically if you throw in. I mean, you can find parameter values so you don't get this qualitative outcome. So I should warn you in that. But I think this is a plausible outcome. What does it show? Well, let me remind you that E is the effort, so that's how hard people work. W is the wage, and U is the unemployment rate. We have two groups of workers. The L are the low power, and the H are the high power. We start out, and that's the top line, where the mu is the same. It's 0.1 for both groups. So they have the same power, and as a result, you find that they have the same effort. There's symmetry in the model, aside from the power. As you now increase the ability of firms to monitor this one group, mu increases. That's this elasticity. Then what you see is that the low power workers start working harder. They're now being monitored, so they would put in more effort. They have to. Their wage is falling, and their unemployment rate is virtually unchanged. What happens to the high power workers, the ones who have not lost power? Well, they also work a little bit harder, but not much. Their wage increases significantly, and their unemployment decreases. So what we see in this model, in this very simple, is actually precisely the stylized fact that we have in the data, and it's not coming from skill bias technical change. It's coming from something where there's no change in skill requirements. It's from a power bias. You find that the low-power workers lose out both in terms of relative wages and in terms of employment. Profits also go up in this setting. The only thing I changed was how easy it is to monitor one of the groups, and this is the outcome. Yeah. Yes?
Is monitoring seen as something that gives you a certain outcome? Like, is it also possible to make it probabilistic, that you can monitor him but you don't know for sure if he's working?
Yes, I mean, this is sort of built into the model almost. It's a good question. You may not, I mean, even with these new gadgets, you may not monitor completely. So you have still a probability that you lose your job. In the limiting case, of course, you could have that there's a required effort level and you monitor perfectly well, and if you go below that, you just lose your job. And then now you can have a contract that is conditional on exactly what effort level. What we're talking about here is just moving towards better monitoring. But it's still just that if you work less hard, your probability of being caught and losing your job has gone up. Yeah?
What about the outside option of the workers? Because you showed that effort goes up, so the security of working goes up,
Yeah.
and the wage goes down at the same
Yeah.
time. So it looks to me as if the participation constraint could no longer be satisfied.
That's taken care of. That's what makes it hideous. If that was constant, then it would be relatively easy to solve it. But because that's endogenous, you have to go back and see what's happening to that.
So basically you assume that this power-based technological change applies to all these jobs these workers could apply for, because then the outside option automatically gets worse.
I have the two groups of workers, yeah. So it applies to the low-power jobs that the low-power workers can take. The high-power jobs, there was no change in monitoring. You could raise that if you want. I mean, the power bias just means that they don't move the same way. One comment one should maybe make is that in this setting, it's fairly obvious that you can have new technology being introduced even if it's not sort of welfare enhancing, even if in some sense it's not technically efficient. If I have a new technique, I'm the firm, I may want to introduce it, even if in some sense the technical efficiency is lower, if the new technique enables me to monitor my workers better so I can squeeze them. As long as I can squeeze them by more than the loss in technical efficiency, I can still get more profits. So yes, Barry.
Are the workers for whom monitoring is more difficult? It seems like they're extracting some of the surplus that's created by the monitoring technology that should, in some sense, go to returns to capital, but instead they're hiding behind the difficulty of monitoring them and basically extracting that. Is that a fair read?
I don't know whether it should go to capital, but I think you're right that yes, as we can see, when you improve the monitoring in one group, the other group benefits from it. So in that sense, you're right, and they do get a job rent from being, from having the power and being hard to monitor. So they get more than their fallback.
They also have an obvious incentive to increase the difficulty, the perceived difficulty at least, of monitoring their output.
Oh yeah. I mean, any worker would have an interest in making it hard to monitor what? Yeah. So that's right. Yeah. What's the intuition? We talked a little bit about this, but the intuition is that in some sense, as you have this power bias technical change where you can monitor somebody better, then the agency problem is the agency problem. The fact that you cannot have a perfect contract, you cannot see exactly what the worker is doing. That is attenuated. That gives a smaller wage premium. That leads to a larger effort, which we see in the data. We see in the data that workers tend to work harder. As Francis Green has done some work on that and finding that as a result. Now, what does that mean? That means that when you have the increased effort, then that raises the effective employment, EN, right? If you keep N constant, now E has gone up, so now you've increased the input of that particular type of labor. And if you now have complementarity between high and low power jobs, then that complementarity in combination with having increased the efficiency of the low power workers implies that shift. I don't know how good your micro-intuition is in that line, but if you think of the homogeneous labor case, it's probably easier to sort of get a feel for what's going on. So think of the truck and truck driver example. So you have complementarity here, one truck driver per truck, right? Or per hour that the truck is driving, you need one driver. Now you have better monitoring, and that leads to lower wages and greater work intensity. Greater intensity implies fewer workers per unit of freight that's being carried. And that means that unless you have a very elastic demand for these transport services, you would now get both the wage lower and the employment lower. So here you see the sort of complementarity, and the same thing works in the two types of labor story. Okay. This was a relatively simple version of power bias technical change, simply being able to monitor a worker. We argue that in some ways power bias technical change can be seen in a broader context. Information technology, communication technology, is a constraint on how large companies operate. Right? Example, imagine you were a large company in the days of the telegraph. You were trying to organize production both here and in Chicago, right? Okay, you can have a factory in Chicago and you can have one here, and you can by telegraph say, send more stuff, right? And then they send more stuff. But you need to have a lot of things pre-planned. You need to know exactly what that stuff is, right? So you basically just send a number. You cannot say, hey, we need to change the design of these shirts we've been making. So here's a new pattern, and could you cut it differently? And there are severe limitations on how you can organize things when you have communication technology that is restrictive like that. You need the pre-processing. You get, as a result, relatively rigid supply systems. You don't get lots of outsourcing where you have sort of different firms that are your suppliers and they're all over the place. Instead, you get vertical integration within the company with this single flow of output. What does that mean? Well, if you have this vertical integration and inflexible production, then that would tend to make firms vulnerable to interruptions anywhere along that supply chain. Which means that workers anywhere along that get significant power. A small group of workers can disrupt a big company by just cutting off one link. If you have outsourcing from a number of different places, if they decide to strike at one factory in China, you can quickly switch and you can get more from somewhere else. Right? But if you have a rigid supply line, then unions along or small groups of workers get significant power. What does that mean? It means that you may actually find that big companies would have an interest in orderly labor markets, in having unions that they can negotiate with, unions that can afterwards sort of enforce the contract and make sure you don't get wildcat operations shutting down the whole thing. An orderly labor market with recognized unions and negotiation could, in this sense, be an advantage also to big business. An example of some of this could be back in one of the famous examples, I guess, from US labor history, the General Motors strikes in 1936 and 37, where a very small number of people shut down a couple of key factories, and within a couple of months, General Motors agreed to negotiate a contract with them, and then the UAW grew rapidly after that. I was looking at any indication of is that recognized, and I think it is recognized in literature here and there. But I also came across when I was Googling something, this came up, and this is from the Wisconsin Code, Chapter 111, which sort of says it. This is for public sector unions, so maybe one should be a little bit careful about applying it to the private sector too. But it does make precisely this argument in favor of unions. It says that public employees and the public itself have an interest in industrial peace, regular and adequate income for the employee, and uninterrupted production of goods and services. Toward that end, an employee has the right, if the employee desires, to associate with others. So in this legal setting, it's actually stated precisely that unions may serve that purpose. Now, another little caveat. This may have sounded up until now as a very deterministic technology determines what's going on. In that sense, maybe very Marxian kind of the basis, and then you get the superstructure on top of that. But notice that the firing risk, which was central in the example that I gave, in the simple model, it describes firm behavior. Right? It's the firm that chooses to fire workers. That behavior is subject to constraints. It's subject to constraints of technology. Can they actually observe what the worker is doing? And that was what I emphasized. But of course, aside from technology, there could be other constraints on what the firm can do. It may be able to observe, but there could be regulation or strong unions or other factors that prevents the firm from actually taking action even if the worker has been caught shirking. And that observation sort of makes it a little bit less deterministic and all technology, and it opens up for maybe an understanding of some of the international differences that we'll see. Regulatory institutional constraints are different in different countries, and I have a slide here that sort of is perhaps an illustration of that. I realize that not many people here can probably read it, but since I come from Denmark, and since Denmark does have strong unions, I thought, hey, how do they cope with strong unions in Denmark? I mean, when I was with this new monitoring in Denmark. So I looked up, I Googled, I found, no, I didn't Google, I went to the main union covering the retail sector. And what I found was there, bang on their website, there was this, you could click on this thing, which tells you all about monitoring in the workplace. What are your rights? What do you do? Talk to your union about this if such and such happens. Here is some information for you. This is what the firm can do, this it cannot do, let us know. What does that suggest? Well, I don't know how strongly they've been able to maybe prevent some of the monitoring or how strongly they're able to regulate what the firm can do with it. But I think it is striking that the first thing that comes up on this union website is something like this with information about what to do and how can you handle it. In the Danish retail sector, most workers would be organized in that union. Okay, let's move on a little bit to the top end. You may say, okay, I have talked about this monitoring. I maybe talked a little bit about institutions and how limitations of, maybe I didn't make that clear, so let me just step back a little bit. The argument I was trying to make is that with a limited information technology, even big business may have an interest in some of those institutional elements that were part of the New Deal. Once you get information technology sort of leapfrogging and becoming much more advanced, then big business may not need it. So institutional change in that sense may be related to or facilitated by some of these changes in technology. That was the argument I was trying to suggest. I did show you in the beginning that some of the big changes have been at the very top. So let me spend just a few words here talking about CEOs and the top end. This is something that with that guy I'm currently working on a little bit because we thought we should update or think about that and see how it might fit in. This table just tells you basically that CEOs and people in the financial sector are a very important part of that very top, and that their income share has been increasing. If you look at the top 1%, that's the first 3 lines. Can you see this? Can you read it? Okay. So that's the top 1%, whose share of income has gone up from 9.7 to 21% between 1979 and 2005. And the executives and finance workers is 4.8, so almost half of that, and that's gone up to 11.3, so that has actually gone up even more in proportionate terms. So this is not an insignificant group. Another way of looking at this CEO story, of course, is to just look at a CEO relative to the compensation of their workers, and you see here this dramatic increase. So now you have, this is for the top 350 firms ranked by sales, and you see that now the ratio is around 2 to 300, where before it was much, much lower. How can we explain this, or does this fit at all within the kind of efficiency wage story that I've been telling? I think it does fit. I think, but it requires some modification. When you get the information technology, communication, that enables firms to basically shift production around the globe and move quickly, shut down, move to China, then in some sense, this increased flexibility increases also, in a sense, the scope of decisions and both the damage and the gain that can come from CEO decisions. CEO make these decisions and they can make or break companies. If you decide to move to China, it can be fantastic or it can be horrible. Now, this, in some sense, you could say would look a little bit like a skill bias technical change, right? The marginal product of CEO input has now increased. It's more consequential. But the question is it that aspect that is dominant, or is it maybe another aspect, or it could be both of them. The other aspect I have in mind is that this increased flexibility, this more volatile environment within which firms work, also brings greater uncertainty. And that means that in some sense it becomes very difficult, given all these sort of random shocks in this uncertain environment, to monitor the top managers and make sure whether they've done the right thing. So you have the combination of maybe in some sense increased marginal product of good decisions, and at the same time a greater difficulty in figuring out whether in fact they did make what looked like the right decision. You can also talk about how maybe at the CEO level there's been increased mobility and because of more general skills. I won't really talk about that here, I guess. Now, we were thinking about this, and initially I guess we thought, oh, well, this is really a skill bias, so maybe at the CEO level we're now coming back to that being the story. But then we thought a bit more, and we set up a small model, which I won't present in detail here, but we will write it up and it'll hopefully be available at some point relatively soon. A small model in which you have a single CEO, and the profits of the company depends on the CEO effort. You can view that as a broad measure, both of putting in a lot of work trying to figure out what is right, but also maybe pursuing the right objectives and not thinking only about getting a nicer corner office or more corporate jets or something. So CEO effort is important, but then there's this random component. And we now have that new flexibility implies that profits become more sensitive to effort, but also that we get a larger variance of the random shock. That's the two elements I talked about in the environment. And if you now think about it in this setting, then it becomes perfectly possible that if outcomes are more sensitive to CEO effort for a given degree of uncertainty, that would actually alleviate the agency problem. Because profits respond to how hard the CEO is working, you would now relatively easily could see whether the CEO has been working hard or not. And therefore, you wouldn't need to pay as much. Believe it or not, you can formalize this and you can get that as an outcome that is not weird. Again, it does not necessarily happen. It does depend on assumptions, but it's a fairly robust outcome. Whereas the greater uncertainty, the second component, that aggravates the agency problem and definitely raises pay. So our argument is that although at the top level there may be a little bit of this kind of winner-take-all marginal productivity has gone up, that may not actually help you explain what's been going on, because that tends to alleviate the agency problem, whereas the greater uncertainty unambiguously goes the right direction in the sense of enabling us to explain what has been happening. Yeah. I would like to finish this before maybe we take a break. I've been told we should try to take 2 breaks, short breaks of 10 minutes. Before we do that, I want to just talk a little bit about how I would like to extend this a little bit. In our formal modeling, we have quite deliberately been staying very close to what you could call mainstream sort of efficiency wage models. You have these utility functions that reflect my own income, and they're kind of exogenously given, and then my effort. But perhaps that version of efficiency wage model is not the most promising. There's a literature, Akerlof has been talking about, you can get efficiency wage models that are based much more on fairness kind of ideas. There are norms of how you should treat me, and if you treat me fairly, then I'll treat you fairly. But it's not a kind of utility function where utility depends on my consumption or my income, right? And that's just exogenously given. Now, why is that potentially interesting? It's potentially interesting because if you start thinking about the norms of fairness, so you're now a firm and you want to treat your CEO fairly, because if you don't do that, he or she will not be providing effort the way you wanted, effort still thought of broadly. If you think of this what is fair as being determined by norms that potentially change over time, then that, I think, may shed light on what has been going on. What do we have in mind? Well, there's been an increasing tendency, I think, in compensation practice to look at what are other CEOs paid. Right? So you get a sample of other CEOs and you say, oh, you know, they get so much. And then you get a kind of Lake Wobegon effect. I mean, our CEO certainly is not worse than the others and should not be paid less, so everybody has to get paid more than the average, which itself is something that tends to ratchet up CEO pay. Finance has experienced an explosion of income pay, or pay to people in finance. If that enters the reference group, the comparison group in any way in terms of its fairness, then that factors in. And the firm's own employees may have had a reduced impact in that comparison group. And all of these movements would tend to reinforce the shift up. The fairness norms that is underlying this story itself may shift in ways that are interesting. So it stays within this kind of efficiency wage setting, but now adding in some if you want, softer elements associated, for instance, with Akerlof's work. That's also something that Fred and I are working a little bit on, and I think that enriches, in a sense, our understanding. But And then I put in just a small thing at the end here about incompetence. Of course, all of this has been trying to explain what's going on in some kind of rational way, but sometimes one wonders if maybe it's all as rational as we sometimes believe here. And a couple of quotes here from one from Krugman and the other from De Bruyn. I suggest we take a break now, the first 10-minute break. And then we'll be back. Thank you. Are there any questions? Maybe I should ask any questions on this here before we move on to a new topic. Yes.
I was wondering very quickly, if one thinks along the traditional way of studying technical change, labor saving technical change and capital saving technical change, can your idea of power bias technical change be embodied in capital labor, capital saving technical change, or it's a completely different approach, a different way of explaining technical change?
It is different. I mean, I deliberately left out any kind of traditional technical change. If you want to go back to, whoops, where is it? My production function here. I assumed that this F function was just constant. If you wanted, you could make it shift. You could add in labor saving or capital saving technical change if you wanted. I didn't do it. So in that sense, what I was talking about does not shift the production function at all. What it does is that it affects how well you can monitor what workers are doing, and that influences their behavior and thereby the efforts.
The reason I was asking the question is, one might want to think that one uses more technology that can also be just captured by the output capital ratio as capital using technical change.
Okay. Maybe I misunderstood you. Yes, I mean, I guess if you put in this fleet black box in the trucks, then that is an increase in capital. There is some cost to it. We didn't include that in this formalization. We assumed that the monitoring technology was in a sense free. It came available. You may be right that really it does require something. For instance, an increase in capital. We didn't do that. Yes.
I think it's extremely interesting. I just wondered if some of the things which have happened during this 30-40 year period are not being held constant. I mean, you already addressed that, for example, there's an increase in uncertainty on, say, these high-tech workers and what they can, how they can affect the outcome of their firm. I want to ask you two things. One is, could it be that there's the increase in vertical intra-industry integration, i.e. greater global supply chains, have actually increased the disruption power of, for example, a Thai worker putting together some hardware that if there's a strike or, for example, as happened, a earthquake somewhere in Haiti, it could disrupt the whole global production chain. And then secondly, so this would go in favor, so in reverse.
That would make the workers stronger. Yeah?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And secondly, you mentioned truck drivers and cashiers. Could it be that these type of low-tech workers are sort of the non-traded goods or non-traded services vis-a-vis, for example, high-skilled workers who are, for example, doing web design or who are doing doctors analyzing scans, these sort of things that can be exported to developing countries, i.e. the high-tech workers might have faced greater competition and therefore their marginal wage should have been reduced. Whereas truck drivers cannot, this service cannot be exported, cashiers cannot be outsourced to China or to India, so that this would have actually decreased the relative wage of those relative high-tech workers.
You could certainly imagine that, and I think there are reasons to believe that some of that could happen. That some high-tech services, whether it's accounting or some medical services or whatever, could increasingly be outsourced to India. Or I don't think it's happened to a significant degree yet, and I don't think it has been reflected in their wages as yet. I could be wrong about that, but one could certainly imagine it happening. The truck drivers have seen a huge decrease in their wage. I should say, however, just so that some of that happened before there was any chips in the trucks, and a lot of it had to do with deregulation of the trucking industry, which is not directly related to this. So if you look at, you see this fantastic decrease. I mean, this is not, some of it is not explained by this. So, yeah.
One of the reasons people like skill-biased technical change so much is that it explains increasing skill premium because of an increase in the relative supply of skills.
Yep.
Can you say anything about the timing of how power-biased technical change works? Like, why is it happening now? Why is it decreasing low-skilled workers' wages now, as opposed to?
I don't think. I mean, I think the skill bias story may have problems with the timing, because if you want to put it down to computers and computer technology, then in some sense the increase in inequality started too soon and it stopped too soon. That's one of the aspects. But you had the increase already from the late 70s when computer technology was not important, and you also have maybe it's sort of leveling off a little bit at a time when you still get a lot of computer technology being implemented. In some ways, I may have similar timing problems. I mean, it's how easy is it to come out and get precise measures of how well are workers being monitored? You know, I don't know that much about it. Fred Guy has read a lot of stuff and has convinced me through countless case studies that this has been important in many places. But can we convincingly say that our timing is perfect and we can explain it? No. What I can say is that our story here, at some level, answers this Tina argument. We got the same result. We got relative employment and relative wages moving in the same direction, and the production function was completely unchanged.
Maybe it is rephrasing your question in a somewhat different way, shifting away the emphasis from the skills. But I think, what is behind this whole thing is the question: how transparent is it to the employee what the employee does and whether he does it right? With a lot of effort. And I mean, if you look at concrete tasks, and for instance, high skills, going back to concrete tasks where now you have 20 people sitting in front of a monitor instead of hammering on something, then all of a sudden this process is much more opaque and it's not quite clear whether they're on this page or on the spreadsheet that they should be on, right? So there's, I think with a lot of concrete technological change, there's an opposite direction in which this goes, which makes monitoring actually more difficult. Right? And of course, these counteract with this. I don't know. Would you consider that important? Is that something that you have to address empirically, or how would you do that?
Oh, I did not mean, if maybe I did. It was not my intention to say that the technology has unambiguously all over the place led to increased monitoring. I think the key point was more the bias, that some types of jobs now can be monitored more closely and other jobs cannot. The CEO, we were arguing, cannot be monitored as closely. It's harder to know whether the CEO is doing a good job. So it was the bias, and undoubtedly also among relatively low-paid, low-power type occupations, there may have been movements in the other direction. We're not claiming that all low-paid jobs can now be monitored better, and all high-paid jobs are the same or cannot be monitored as well.
Oh. It's just the flip side of the story. Maybe that's exactly the thing that the
Yeah.
what this person has done with composition work
Yeah.
to students.
Yeah, harder to know whether the right decisions have been made. Yeah, yeah. No, that I agree with. Yeah. Johannes?
I have a quick question concerning the mathematical model where it's just saying this complete symmetry assumption. Is that essential in deriving the results? Is it dependent on that, or is that just a technical convenience, so to say?
No, it's more. I mean, you don't want to leave yourself open to the charge. Hey, you cooked the books by introducing all kinds of asymmetries. So we started out with something where they're complete symmetry, and they get the same weight. And then we say, okay, let's now change one parameter only, namely, how well can you monitor the low-paid work, the low-power workers? So that's trying to make it as transparent as possible.
Do I understand correctly that you say the number of high-skilled and low-skilled workers is the same, like symmetric in that model, or is that?
Yeah. High power, low power. There's no, in reality, skill and power may often be correlated. Although not necessarily. I mean, like you can think of musicians. Musicians have very high skill, but perhaps little power. Right? I mean, so it's not. Often there may be a correlation, but yeah, no. We assume complete symmetry. Symmetry in the production function when we parameters. I mean, so.
Have you tried what changes if you go beyond this assumption?
Did we do that? I'm not sure we introduced lots of asymmetries like that, but that I'm not worried about. Maybe I should be. I don't. Maybe we should do it, but I don't think we've done that. We checked robustness to a lot of parameter changes, but we didn't. I don't think we changed the symmetry. Oh. Yeah.
So this model output does not change after the model.
Output does not change.
The reason I'm asking is I was wondering what the solution is for why the low monitor workers
I don't know whether I fully understood your question, but this is a model that is, in some sense, too simple. Right? It's a one good model. Output is homogeneous, and so we're not talking. The amount of output, yes, it will change. It will change as we change the power. You get a new endogenous equilibrium, and that equilibrium will determine both the effort levels. I mean, if we determine the effort and the employment, the effort here and the employment and the capital stock is given, then we get as a result of that an output. I didn't give you the effect on output in the table, but it will change as well. Where is the table? Yeah. You can see how as I change the sensitivity here, you get changes in the effort levels, you get changes in unemployment, which maps into changes in employment. So as the inputs change, you would get a change in output. I'm not freezing output. Output is adjusted endogenously as well.
If we suppose that output increases from monitoring, what would be the intuition for why low monitor workers would
If output...
their wages
Well, I think the best intuition is if you go to the homogeneous labor. I mean, you can think of it if you're used to thinking in terms of multiple inputs, you can do that as well. But here, if you have, so you have this these workers, these truck drivers. You get them to work harder at a lower wage. But if the demand for truck driving services is relatively inelastic, then you'll end up employing fewer of them.
So the truck drivers are monitored.
They're monitored better, yeah.
What about the ones that are not?
Why would it increase? Because if you have a production function and you now get an increase in the supply and the employment of this other group of workers, then the marginal product of the other group goes up. Do we have? If you forget about efforts for the time being, if you have output as a function of two types of labor, L1 and L2, then you would get.
Peter, use another pen.
Well, that's easy. Is that better? That's not much better. But you get the relative wage would depend on the relative employment, right? So in some sense, if you get more employment here, and you get that by increasing their effort. So you increase effort. Effort goes up, that increases this part. And if this increases relative to that, then you would get higher wages. Well, output, that depends on not the ratio of E1, L1 to E2, L2. It's the ratio here that determines relative wages. What happens to output depends both on this and what's happened to the absolute level, in a sense. I may misunderstand your question. Maybe we should talk about this and we can write it down so we can. Yeah?
Just one quick question on how you conceptually think results from this can carry over to, say, European labour markets, where, I mean, very often in theory we've been told that somehow the efficiency wage model is the one to be used for non-unionized labour markets, and the trade union model is the one we should use for the European ones. I mean, somehow the result is attractive. I wonder how do you think can carry into that case?
I think that's a good question, and the answer is that initially we thought of this as a model for the U.S. labor market. We were primarily interested in what has been happening in the U.S. and some other Anglo-Saxon countries where you've had this big increase in inequality. You've had less of an increase in many European countries. So that was our starting point. And we thought, hey, the efficiency wage model is a good starting point for this, and it captures our notion of power, and so that was good. My response to how does this fit with the European would sort of, it's not a very good response because it's not very complete, at least as yet. But it has to do with this slide here, right? The firing risk, in a sense, depends not just on technology, but also on the regulations and institutions. And you can make the case that in the European setting where regulation may be tighter and unions may be stronger, there may not even be the same incentive to introduce some of these monitoring technologies, because if you can't act on it in any case, and if unions are opposed to it, and even if you do introduce them, there may be limitations in how you can punish your shirking workers, and that obviously would affect the outcome. So at the moment, my tentative answer is that maybe I would now push this framework to be relevant more than I thought initially, also to a European case. It just requires that you bring in some of the non-technology issues much more strongly in the interpretation of what's been going on. It's not a very good, because it reflects something that I'm not still quite clear about in my own mind.
It's also with weakening unions in parts of the European labour market. So it's very complicated.
Yeah. I hope to be maybe thinking and working more on that, and maybe in a couple of years I could give you a better answer.
Maybe I'll take us back to I was looking at the employment effects on the high skilled versus the low skilled. As you get more low skilled employed, whereas your wages get lower. So I'm thinking, in this kind of model, isn't there this incentive to reduce high-skilled employees. Assuming that endogenously the ability to supervise gets better, and so you don't need as many.
Oh, you're thinking of the supervisors as high skill, and so you need fewer of those. That could well be the case. Again, I mean, like the way we set it up here, our monitoring technology is in a sense costless. We did not model what cost and what supervisors or how you might need fewer supervisors, but that could be an effect.
Because you realize that sooner or later you need more high-tech people to do the job in 5 months.
I don't have a good answer.
I basically have a very stupid question. Thank you so much for challenging the Tina assumption. That was, that's the major thing in your model, I feel. It's just your focus on effort instead of value-added production per hour is something I find a little disconcerting on an intuitive level, especially if you're ultimately looking at the risk to be fired as the ultimate incentive to work harder. What's the reflection? How does your model relate to real economic data? So it has a great theoretical construct, but what's the explanation power behind your model for real economic data?
Well, a lot of this we don't have data for. It's very hard to measure relative power. But let me just repeat one thing that comes out of this, and that I think there is evidence for, and that's the increase in work intensity, in particular at some lower level jobs. And I think that has been documented. And that comes out here as, hey, this is an implication, along with the increased inequality. But of course, most of these things you cannot look up the statistical yearbook and find a measure of effort.
Right, but you could say that increased work intensity could be partly explained by a diminished value due to trade, due to the openness, to a diminished value added component per hour worked. But in order to make up that diminished capacity, you'd have to add to intensity.
You're absolutely right, but there may be many other. I mean, I do not want to suggest that this is the only thing that's going on. Right? There could be. Personally, I think that the sort of globalization broadly has been very important. I also am willing to accept that skill biases in some cases have played a role. I think that when we come back after the break, I'll be talking about something very different than this, that I also think has played a role. So I mean, I hear you as saying, hey, that there's other stuff going on, and that is, I buy that. This was, I mean, I think when you do modeling, you often want to strip away as much as you can and focus on this is the mechanism I'm interested in. Let me try to highlight that and see whether the logic of what I'm saying is sound. If you throw in too much at the same time, it's much harder to figure out where the damage comes from. So that would be. Shall we take a 10-minute break? I love this actually, but maybe we should just stop and keep talking instead of. I think we need a 10-minute break. I think I need a 10-minute break. I can feel that I'm not thinking. Okay, I guess we're ready to roll again. And I guess we'll have only one break, and we've had it now. So the next theme, as I said, is different. It's not. It doesn't exclude the power bias, but it's a different angle. And again, something that I think could be relevant for what we've seen, but it's not the only explanation. There are other factors playing in. As you can see very clearly, this is a graduate. He is a college graduate. And as you can also see, he did not get the job he had hoped for. I don't know him, but I got his picture from Business Week, which, a couple of months ago, had this story about how college grads find a retail, a meager route to job market. They tell us how overeducated, underemployed, and disgruntled these graduates are now staying at home in their parents' houses and unable to find the jobs they look for. And instead, students with advanced degrees end up working in these relatively low-skill positions. You see similar stories. When I gave the talk last year, I think I had a picture of somebody from New York Times that also had a story of that nature from a couple of years ago. But you see it all the time. And here's a little bit more sort of organized information on that. This is from the State of Working America. And it tells you the proportion of college graduates by age who are working jobs that simply do not require a college degree. And as you see, that has been going up. But perhaps just as noteworthy, it's starting at a very high level. So we're talking for the young 20 to 24 age group, which I don't know how many college graduates there are in that age group, but I guess there are some. It's very high, up to close to 40% of those now have jobs that do not require a college degree. And if you look at the 25 to 29, then it's almost 30% that in 2010 were in jobs for which they were overqualified. But even back in 2000, the percentages were quite significant. I couldn't resist this one. This is from the New York Times, and I guess it's sort of just indicative that the problem is serious enough that even agony aunts have to take it into consideration. So here's this agony aunt kind of thing. What do I do? I'm overqualified. I got this job. How do I cope with it? And you get good advice on how to cope from this. Yes.
What was the advice?
Look at the bright side, sort of thing. What does it say? Oh, I didn't print the advice. I think it's basically look at the positives. I should find out. Here's some evidence that my co-author on this paper, Fabian Slonimczyk, has constructed, and that's an attempt to figure out in the U.S. labor market how many college educated are in jobs for which they are overqualified, and also how many people might be in jobs for which they are nominally undereducated. And what this shows is that these are quite significant numbers. You have at the bottom, you have low skill. High skill here is college or above. Right? So you have low skill workers who are in low tech jobs. Skill is the person, tech is the job. Right? So you're matched if you're a low skill person in a low tech job. And you can see that of course the proportion of low skill workers has been declining. And then you have the dark one is the low skill workers in high-tech jobs. So they're nominally undereducated. They have jobs where seemingly they don't have the qualifications. It's a relatively small proportion, but it's there in the data. And then you have the next, that's the high-skill workers who have low-tech jobs. That's the people working retail with a college degree. And then you have the ones that are matched. Now, how do you measure this? Again, there are all kinds of issues involved, and you can take different routes to trying to measure it. Some people, there's a lot of, I should say, this is our measurement, but our measurement is in line with what most other researchers find. You can take different routes to trying to estimate these things. One route is to ask people, your job, does that require your education? Yes, no. And you can use that subjective measure to indicate whether people are overqualified. You can also do something statistically where you say, okay, you have retail sector here, and you find most people have a high school, and then there's some people working there who have a college degree, and you say, hey, they stick out. Clearly, if everybody else can do it with a high school, these are overeducated. So that's just looking at jobs and finding out if there are outliers in a sense. Or you can do what we did here, which is, or what Fabian did. I did not touch the data, but what Fabian did, which is use different databases, including the DOT, the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, which has very detailed descriptions of job requirements, and match that to the skills of the workers who are in those jobs, and use that to get a measure of workers overeducated. All of these have their potential drawbacks. There are clearly errors in this. There are mismeasurement issues. But most of these studies do find a significant proportion of people who are mismatched, which should not be a surprise, because most of us probably know examples where we would say this is clearly the case. What is interesting in this graph is not just that you have significant numbers of people who are mismatched, who are overqualified, but also that it's not constant. If you look at particular that white band of people who are over-educated for their jobs, it clearly has a trend. It's increasing, and it's increasing quite significantly over this period. This is the period dictated by data. So that's why it starts in '73 and goes to 2002. We couldn't get data that were comparable beyond those periods. Now, is this important? I think it is important. It's important because it seems to be a stylized fact, just that you do have this significant mismatch in the labor market. But it's also important because it casts doubt on the sort of common assumption that, hey, if we want to deal with inequality issues, then clearly we just need to give people education, right? If we educate people, then we solve it. If we have already a large proportion of college-educated people who end up in low-skilled jobs, then it's not obvious that the education strategy is the way to address the inequality problem. And the other question is, if you have a significant amount of mismatch of that nature, then maybe we should be a little bit careful about assuming that our standard kind of comparative statics actually apply in this setting. And this is the question that we want to address here. And in particular, we then want to say, okay, once we've established a model that tells us something about what determines the amount of overeducation, what happens if now in this model we introduce institutional change, for instance, a change in the minimum wage? But we first need to set up the model where we find out what would determine the amount of overeducation that we get. Yes, I have a question.
One quick question. I mean, very often the response to the overeducation thing and the strategy part would be, I'm not saying I'm sharing it, but I wonder what your view is on that. That there are, of course, parts of the broadening education strategy also somehow result in lower standards being set, and some lower-end universities will decide that just not producing the types of skills that are on the paper.
I think that's a very good question. I think it is a cause for concern. We did look at that when we were writing this paper, and we tried to looked at some education literature and psychology literature and whatever, and the evidence that we found was that in fact, if you look at SAT scores, I mean, there are certain scores that are nominally at least comparable along, then there was not this great decline in fact, some people, I think, even claimed that there might have been, once you correct for there were some issues about the proportion of people who take these tests, so there were issues in measuring that as well. I think it's a very good question. I think one should be concerned about it. And can I claim that there has been no decline in the standards of college degrees, say, or of high school degrees? No, but I don't think the evidence is overwhelming that there has been, at least at the high school level. So great question. And yeah.
May I ask you something?
Yes, yes, certainly.
If the dictionary of occupational titles was used to construct the graph, that means that for an occupation that has the same name during all the period, you would always classify it in the same group, right? High or low skilled occupation. But there might be some occupations that have been changing from being less skill intensive to more skill intensive while keeping the same name. So machinery operator, for example, I can imagine something in the 60s or 50s that was very simple, and maybe those are now operated by computers or whatever. While on the other hand, I have a hard time thinking on an occupation that kept the same title that became less skill intensive. So I don't know if that can bias the graph.
It could. You know, you're asking now about the data set, and I don't, that was mainly Fabian, so I may not be able to give you right here the full answer. It is in the paper, but we have, the DOT is updated, so it's not just that there's one measure. There are several years. How many and exactly where they are, I don't remember. So you do see some changes. You can then question, have they been changed significantly? Have they been changed enough given what has happened in reality? And I guess I do not know. I have not been out there. But it's not just that we have one classification and then that carries through. There were at least two. Aside from that, I think I'll have to go back and consult exactly what Fabian did. But I think it is in the paper that I think actually was circulated to everybody. I think he describes exactly what he's doing. But that's another good question. I mean, can we trust both the educational measures? Can we trust the skill requirement measures? Probably not. But then do we take the route of saying, oh, let's just assume there's perfect match, right? That goes against what I seem to just observe, and it goes against all the attempts that I know of trying to measure it in different ways, using different techniques, and they all come out saying there is a significant amount of overeducation. Yeah. Okay. So the next step here in this project would be to now say, okay, what determines this amount of overeducation? Is there some theory we can come up with that would explain why some people are overeducated? And maybe because of, I don't know, my bias, I kind of like efficiency wage models. I think they do capture something. And so that was the route I took. I think you can do something similar with matching models, or in fact you can do something with where you don't specify what is the underlying. So in the paper you see first an outline just where we have functions that we don't describe exactly where they come from, but they could be derived from different underlying stories. Here I'll talk about this specific model, and again sort of trying to be as acceptable to most mainstream as possible. We started out with something that is well established, the Shapiro-Stiglitz model of efficiency wages. It's not that you have to use that, but it was an attempt to start with something where we could not be accused of, in a sense, oh, you're choosing something completely esoteric, something that nobody believes in. We started with something that is mainstream. You know, it's Romer in his textbook devotes I don't know how many pages to this model, right? So we'll take the Shapiro-Stiglitz model. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's basically an efficiency wage model. So workers can provide effort or not. It simplifies the setting by saying either you work or you shirk. So it's a 0-1. It's not a continuous effort function, but you can choose to work or you can choose to shirk. And that makes it easy to do some intertemporal optimization, and that's what Stiglitz does. So you have workers intertemporally optimizing explicitly. Now we want to of course look at this overeducation, the mismatch. And that means that we need, again, to have at least two groups of workers, right? So we'll have high and low skilled workers, and we'll have high and low tech jobs. good and bad jobs. And we'll now have mismatch that is determined endogenously. How would that come about? Well, the intuition is relatively straightforward. If you have in a standard efficiency wage model, you have some workers who are just as good as the others, but they don't get a job. Right? You need to have a wage premium, and that's wage premium, if there's symmetry across workers and firms, can only exist if some workers are unemployed. Now you have these high-skilled workers, they're unemployed in a normal efficiency wage model. Once you have the two types of jobs, then these workers would have an option that they don't have if you only have one type of worker. Namely, they could say, okay, I didn't get the good job, but I could try to get a bad job. That is better than having no job at all. So this is how you get the mismatch. We'll assume that only the high-skilled workers have this option. We are ruling out from this theoretical model the option that low-skilled workers could apply for high-tech jobs and get them. It would complicate matters, and it's not essential to our argument. And it seems plausible that the undereducation somehow reflects some kind of mismatch. I mean, you would not keep a job for which you're not qualified. You would have gotten your qualifications one way or the other. So high-skilled workers now can try to get a good job. If they fail to get that, they may try to get a bad job. And so you get, in bad jobs, you will get both the high-skilled and the low-skilled workers employed. Make sense? Here again, a bit of math, and this is, for those of you not familiar with the Shapiro-Stiglitz model, don't worry about it, but this is basically just extending the standard Shapiro-Stiglitz equations to this case where you have two types of jobs and two types of workers, some of whom can be overqualified in jobs. Yeah, I won't talk about it because we don't have too much time. What you get from this model in the end is some wage equations. If you think of the simple model, Shapiro-Stiglitz, where you have just one type of workers, then you get the no-shirking condition, right, which is an increasing function. As you get lower unemployment, then you need to pay a higher wage in order to provide the sort of discipline to make people actually work. Okay? In this setting, you get similar no-shirking conditions or wage equations, but you get initially three of them. You get a sort of wage equation for high-skilled workers in the good jobs, and that's the top equation. Then you get for high-skilled workers in the bad jobs, in the low-tech jobs, and you get for low-skilled workers in the low-tech jobs. The arguments in these wage equations, there are various parameters that relate to how likely is it you get caught shirking, for instance, or what is the separation rate in jobs for reasons that have nothing to do with shirking. You move to Seattle to marry somebody, right? You leave the job. And there's also your discount rate. So there are various parameters that we'll treat as constant. There's no power bias technical change here. We'll leave that out. And aside from that, you get unemployment rates coming in. And that's what you see, the fraction in the numerator, the top, that's the unemployment rate for high-skilled workers. But what matters is also how many of the high-skilled workers have the good job, in a sense, right? So that's what you get in the second fraction up here, the top. For the low-skilled workers, it's just their unemployment rate. They don't have different types of jobs they could go to. And then you have, for the high-skilled workers in low-tech jobs, you get this. Okay. Details don't matter. Yes?
Why would they be different, the wages in the low-skilled job?
In equilibrium, the two wages there would be the same, because I will assume that the productivity of a high-skilled or a low-skilled worker in a low-tech job is the same. That's just simplifying. You could make the high-skilled workers have a productivity that's lambda times the low-skill, and it would just introduce an extra parameter. So in equilibrium, those two WHL and WLL will have to be the same. You would not have the firm employing workers with the same productivity and the same job at different wages. They would switch. Thank you. I should have put that on the slide too. Again, you have a production function and you have some first order conditions that determine how many workers are employed. And out of this, you now get endogenously determined in this model. You get determined not just the unemployment levels, but also the underemployment level, how big a proportion of the high-skilled workers will end up in the bad jobs. It becomes an equilibrium outcome. And it turns out that indeed you can get very surprising, perverse comparative static results. I should say, I hope I emphasized this. I didn't. But these perverse outcomes are things that can happen. They need not always happen, but it can happen. And just to illustrate, it is possible that if you increase in this economy, if you increase the number of high-skilled workers, so you get an increase in the relative supply of high-skilled workers, our normal intuition would say, hey, if you get that shift in relative supply, then we should get relative wages moving in the opposite direction, right? You have more high-skilled workers, so their relative wage should drop. It is possible in this situation that, in fact, as you increase the proportion of high-skilled workers, you may get the high-skilled wage, relative wage going up. And the sort of intuition for that is that when you increase the number of high-skilled workers, some of them will actually go into the low-tech jobs and potentially squeeze out the low-skilled workers. And as a result of that, you don't necessarily get, but you can get these sort of perverse comparative statics. Now, those are not what I'm primarily interested in here. But once you know that weird things can happen, it then becomes interesting to say, okay, let's try it in this setting. We know that I believe that looking at the data, mismatch is actually an important phenomenon empirically. We can explain how it might arise as an equilibrium phenomenon in this model. Let's now, in this model, try to examine what would be the implications of institutional changes of the kind we have observed. For instance, the minimum wage has declined. The sort of mainstream TINA argument was, hey, that cannot have been an exogenous kind of factor because the movements in relative employment suggest that it must have been a demand shift, right? But let's now have a setting where there's no shift, there's no skill bias technical change, there's no shift in the production function, but we have this endogenously determined mismatch. And let's try to look at what happens as we change the minimum wage. Enno, how are we doing for time? It seems to be very late. Is that right?
No, I think it's an hour.
Oh, okay. I thought we were completely out of time. Okay, so we have time. Okay. So if we now introduce a minimum wage in this setting, right? Then for it to be interesting, the minimum wage has to be high enough that it's binding. So it has to be higher than the wage that would otherwise have been generated for the low-skilled workers. Otherwise, it doesn't make any change. But it shouldn't be as high as to be binding for both types of jobs. So you want the minimum wage to be somewhere where it's binding for the bad jobs, but not for the good jobs. To be binding for the bad jobs, what does that mean? Well, that means that now the no shirking condition, the wage that I had derived before for the model, that no shirking condition cannot be binding for both types of workers in low-tech jobs. By assumption, firms are forced to pay more than they would have had to do to employ that number of workers without having them shirking. So that means some of the workers that are shirking actually now get a wage that's above their no shirking condition. Okay? Now that leaves open a number of possibilities. Are both workers in that situation, both types of workers in that situation, or only one type of worker who gets the jobs? And initially we didn't quite know how to proceed then. But then I guess we thought a bit and we went back and we read stuff. And I think there is evidence. Truman Bewley in his big book from '99 and also in a shorter paper in the EER from '98, he went out, wonderful book. Let's try to find out what's actually happening instead of just theorizing. And he went out and tried to find out why firms don't cut pay or cut wages when there's lots of unemployment. And along the way, he came up with other information. And one of his, he has two sort of striking features that he highlights. And one of them is that firms are shunning overqualified job applicants, that a large number of firms are very reluctant or completely unwilling to hire workers that are greatly overeducated. He also discusses a bit why that's the case, but that doesn't really matter for us here. But what that suggests is that it may be, the plausible case may be that firms prefer to hire the low-skilled workers in the low-tech jobs, and they will do that up to the point where the no-shirking condition is actually binding for those people, and so it will not be binding for the high-skilled workers in low-tech jobs. This is an empirically based assumption. I think we have good reasons for making it, but there's no a priori theory behind it. It is based on these observations, this evidence that says firms are unwilling to do. And I should warn you, the assumption is important. It's not innocuous. So if you dispute that, you would, I mean, then. Now, once you have that, and again, we had the equations. We can now plug in a minimum wage, and we can see what happens to our endogenously determined outcome as we change the minimum wage. And here again, using what I think are plausible parameters. If you wanted, we can go through and talk about in detail what they are. And I should again say that I think they're plausible, but it's not a necessary outcome. You can make parameter choices so it doesn't happen. In this setting, I have the minimum wage in the first column over on the extreme left, and then I have NLL is employment of low-skilled workers in low-tech jobs. Then you have employment of high-skilled workers in low-skilled jobs, low-tech jobs. That's NHL. NL is the sum of those, so that's the total number of low-tech jobs. NH is total number of high-tech jobs, which would correspond to the employment of high-skilled workers in high-tech jobs. WH is the wage to be in the high-tech jobs. By assumption, the minimum wage is binding, so that is the wage in the low-tech jobs. Omega here is the degree of overeducation, so that's the proportion of workers who are in jobs for which they're overeducated. N is total employment, and WHA over W is the ratio of the average wage of a high-skilled worker to the average wage of a low-skilled worker. The average wage of a high-skilled worker is this weighted average of what they would get in the good jobs and the bad jobs. Remember, they don't have the same job. So this is what you would be measuring when you go out and look at the college premium, because then you would look at the education and not what jobs they're in. And then sigma here is a measure of dispersion within group inequality. So that's the dispersion within the group of high-skilled workers, where some get a good wage and some get the bad wage. Okay, in this setting, imagine that you start out with a high minimum wage. So we're now back in 1979, right? Relatively high minimum wage. And then you let it slide. It wasn't that the minimum wage actually was reduced in nominal terms, but it's just inflation eroded it, right? So if you start, say at minimum wage of 2, and you have the outcome here, now you reduce it to 1.9, what happens is that NLL drops. So you get a lower employment of the low-skilled workers. That's their employment. That drops. Their unemployment rate goes up. You get an increased number of high-skilled workers in the low-tech jobs. That's the second column. You get a slight increase in total employment of low-skilled workers, but you get a decrease in the employment of high-skilled workers in high-tech jobs. And as a result, total employment actually decreases. So we reduce the minimum wage, and as a result of that, we get a decrease in employment, which is exactly what you would not expect in a normal model, right? You also get an increased amount of overeducation. You're now getting both increased unemployment and also an increase in underemployment, in people getting jobs for which they're overqualified coming out of this. And of course, you get an increase in within-group inequality. That's the sigma at the end. The relative wage, also the one you measure when you look at college versus non-college wages, has gone up, as you would expect. The minimum wage has gone down, and you get the increased. So you get increased wage inequality, and you get a shift in employment away from the low skill towards the high skill coming out of this, and a decline in total employment. Now, what's the intuition? How does this happen? You get this, well, I guess here I talked about a rise. I guess I talked about a fall before. Can you switch? Now we're looking at a rise. The standard argument would be if you increase the minimum wage, then you would reduce employment, right? In this case, if you increase the minimum wage, then you can now employ more of the low-skilled workers, because that's what firms would like to do as long as they're not shirking. And if you're forced to increase the wage, then you can now employ more of them and they will not be shirking. You were up where that was binding, okay? That means that some of the high-skilled workers who had the bad jobs are now thrown into open unemployment. What does that mean? Well, that means that the fallback position for the high-skilled workers in the good jobs has now deteriorated because before they could get the bad jobs, now they can't get them. So as the fallback position of the skilled workers in the high-tech jobs, as that drops, as that deteriorates, that means that you get a downward shift in the no-shirking condition for these high-tech jobs. If that downward shift is big enough, then firms will actually start hiring more of these high-skilled workers in the high-tech jobs, and that may even pull. I didn't do it in this particular example I talked about. It could even pull an increased number of low-skilled jobs with it. That's perfectly possible. But that's the intuition behind it. And the empirical, or the numerical example shows that yes, indeed, it could happen. It's not something that's, I mean, the intuition here one might come up with, but it's not obvious, at least it wasn't obvious to me before we'd done the simulations, whether in fact you would need to really cook the books to get anything like this come out. What are the implications? Well, the implications is that a reduction in the minimum wage, as we have seen, can indeed increase wage inequality, not surprisingly, but it can also shift employment towards high-skilled workers. That is precisely the implication. And it may even reduce aggregate employment. Low-skilled workers will suffer this double blow of falling employment and falling wages, as we observe in the data. What does that say? It says the TINA argument is false. Logically, does not say that skill bias has not been important. But I said, in this model, there's no shift in the production function. Instead, I've just started out from the observation that you do observe empirically a fair amount of mismatch of people being overeducated. It seems to be not just a short-run cyclical phenomenon, but something that persists. Can we explain it? Yes, we can explain it. Here's one explanation based on the Shapiro-Stiglitz, a very mainstream kind of framework. it gives this result. We can use now our endogenous determination of the degree of overeducation to try to, in the model, see what would happen if we change the minimum wage. And this is what we find. Is there any evidence? Well, here, again, I guess I have the minimum wage curve that I showed you before, how it's been declining. This other curve shows you that in looking at this one, you should be a little bit careful because the federal minimum wage is not always the binding one. In particular, in recent years, many individual states have had minimum wages that are above the federal minimum wage. And that is indicated here. On the right-hand side, you have the share of the workforce covered by higher state minimum wages than the federal. And you see how that in the early period was not significant, but it gets more significant later. So that means one should be a little bit careful if one is looking at evidence because of this discrepancy between maybe the state minimum wage and the federal. We tried to estimate this model. You can take the model and you can from that get sort of reduced form relations. There's some exogenous variables, and basically what you find is that the unemployment rate in the model would be a function of relative supply. That was my H over L. And then it would be a function of the minimum wage. Those are the two exogenous elements in the setting. So we estimated these unemployment equations here for low skill workers, low skill being below college, right? And we did that both in time series for the US as a whole, and we did it in a state panel regressions. State panel would be good in the sense that we have this state variation in what is the effective minimum wage, and also because it gives us many more observations. So in that sense, it's nice. The only reason for doing the time series is that the US labor market has a lot of mobility. And so it may not be plausible at the state level to treat the relative supply of high-skilled workers in that state as exogenous. That may respond to what jobs are available. But anyway, what we find is that we get consistently, we get the negative sign that an increase in the minimum wage reduces the unemployment rate, which is what our model predicts and which is what is inconsistent with the simple standard kind of story. This is for low-skill unemployment. High-skill unemployment, again, we get, but less significantly, we get a negative coefficient on the minimum wage. And when we look at the measure of overeducation, where again we would expect if you increase the minimum wage, overeducation should go down. And if you see the second line, we get consistently, and in this case significant everywhere, coefficient. Overeducation goes down when you increase the minimum wage. Does this prove we are right? No, of course not. But at least it says that a first sort of, if we estimate this, we get in fact the results that we predicted. And in particular, this overeducation is not something that people have been talking about, and it does come out exactly the way we predicted in the model, in the response to minimum wage. Is this a spurious correlation? A lot of people have found that you have the minimum wage coming in significantly in their wage and employment equations. And author Katz Kearney, in a recent paper, comment explicitly on that, and they say, "Oh, this is most likely just a spurious correlation." The argument that they provide is largely that it must be spurious because you find that even sort of at the upper end of the income distribution, you find that the minimum wage appears to have some influence, and that does not seem plausible, right? they say. So if you find it having some impact, not as large as it has at the bottom, but it has some impact seemingly up at the top, then it's a spurious correlation. And they say what I mentioned in the beginning, that really maybe these changes in institutions are a response to fundamental market forces. It's politicians that allow the minimum wage to fall because the fundamental demand shifts mean that that's important if you want to avoid unemployment. Now, I don't find this convincing, and one reason is that part of his argument seems to be based on this sort of Tina argument. They say, okay, but why could it come in? Well, it's just because it reflects this. It had to happen, right? But it didn't have to happen. The model says no. Our standard assumptions about comparative statics may not hold. So the argument that politicians had to let this happen, otherwise we would have had unemployment, that certainly is not true. So the explanation that fundamental market forces really dictated it is only valid if you buy their theoretical story without the mismatch. Secondly, one may accept that the minimum wage in this relation captures other things that are going on as well. But it does not follow that what it captures is the fundamental market forces. It could be capturing other non-market changes that have been taking place over this same period. It's not just a decline in the minimum wage. You've got the union strength, you've got the deregulation, you've got a whole range of sort of neoliberal non-market changes that are correlated with the minimum wage. And it may be capturing some of those. So even if one says some of this may be spurious, it certainly does not follow that it's spurious because it really is capturing fundamental market forces. It may be capturing other non-market forces. And finally, just about the comment that we have some influence higher up in the income distribution. It's not just at the bottom. I don't find that surprising. I mean, our model sort of had this extreme sort of two group, right? In reality, of course, you have a whole range of skills, and you would get this cascade of effects where I don't know, PhDs from Harvard who had expected to get a job in Yale maybe get one at Bucknell, right? And then the ones who would have gotten one at Bucknell, and so you can get over-education as a cascade coming down. And the same way, if you change the minimum wage, you would see repercussions above the very minimum wage level. So the fact that there's some smaller effect high up in the income distribution does not really bother me that much. There's a lot of other evidence that also has found that the minimum wage does not have the negative employment effects. And I should mention that. Our story is distinct in terms of theory. In terms of theory, I guess Manning's book from 2003, Monopsony in Motion, I think it's called, outlines a whole range of different models that produces some kind of monopsony at the firm level. And there's a Card-Kruger, very famous study initially, and my colleague Aaron Dubé from UMass, together with co-authors, have recently done other studies, again looking at more detailed local evidence and finding that the minimum wage does not have the bad employment effects. So in that sense, our finding is not sort of completely strange. It is in line with other findings. Our story is a little bit different, and maybe the best way to outline that is to say what is the standard story that has been provided for these findings, and that's the monopsony story. Yes?
Yeah. Still regarding the data,
Uh-huh.
given that you have two competing explanations and that you have panel data, wouldn't it be possible to try to test like some kind of Granger causality where you try to see if what moves first is, for example, the labor market, and then you see the effect on the minimum wage, or what you see is that first the minimum wage moves, and then you see an effect on the labor market? Because if you were able to distinguish that.
To do the causality level. That's a very good idea. I think that's very great topic. I don't have the skills to do the econometrics. Co-authors have done that, and I don't know whether these Granger causality kind of tests, whether they would.
It's kind of mechanical, right? Because if people foresee
Yeah.
changes, they could act.
There are. I mean,
using
yeah.
rational
Yeah.
expectation.
Shopping Granger course is Christmas, right? I mean, you know. Yeah. But still, I mean, it's a good thought.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks. I will tell my co-author. He's got work to do here. Actually, maybe I'll skip this because if we don't have much time, let me just say that our story, although in some sense we get monopsony effects coming out of the model, right? We get the fact that you can increase the minimum wage and that leads to higher employment. So that's a kind of monopsonistic effect. But it is not, and I guess that was the only point I wanted, it is not monopsony at the level of the individual firm. It's not the individual firm that has wages go up as it wants to increase employment. We do not have that in the model. Our monopsonistic effects come about through macroeconomic interactions. It is this increase in the minimum wage that produces a downward shift in the supply curve of high-skilled workers, and that gives the aggregate effect. Is it interesting? I mean, is this a more convincing explanation than some of the monopsony stories? I think some of the monopsony stories at the individual firm level are valid. I think this is interesting, partly because I think it may have some power as well to explain what's going on. But it's also interesting because it attaches itself to observed phenomena of many workers are in jobs for which they're overqualified. And in that sense, it speaks directly to some of the strategies that have been suggested for fighting inequality, namely just increased education, which in this story would not be the way to go. And the sort of micro-level monopsony stories don't have that aspect. So they may be powerful in some ways, but they sort of address different issues in some sense. Okay. Should I stop here and give a chance for talks, for questions and comments before we move on, or what would you like me to do? I had thought we would do a little bit about some macro implications. Should we do that and then have questions? I see somebody nodding. Okay, let's do that then. This is very sketchy. This is not the full macro implications, but it's an attempt to illustrate just some ways in which inequality may interact with macro. Before we get to the specific example that I've formalized, let's think a little bit about what the general problem is. If you believe, as I think most people do, and I think there's evidence in favor of it, that the rich tend to save a larger proportion of their income than the poor, right? If in that setting you shift income from the poor to the rich, then that would tend to reduce aggregate demand. Consumption propensities would drop. That would tend to put downward pressure on aggregate demand, possibly lead to a recession. How could that be avoided? You have the shift that would tend to lead to recession. How could that be avoided? Well, there are several possible ways that you could avoid the recession from materializing. One is that you could have public policy. You could have fiscal policy or monetary policy that responds to any tendency for aggregate demand to weaken. And in fact, of course, in the US, you did see increasing deficits. A trade surplus could also come in and could take up the slack in demand. I put that in parentheses because that did not happen in the US. It could have, but it did not. But then there's another element, and that's bubbles. You could potentially offset this weakening aggregate demand if you could get wealth to increase, and wealth affects consumption behavior. And if you had some kind of bubble, whether it's a stock market bubble or it's a housing bubble, that in itself could compensate on the consumption side for the shift in income distribution. Now, so far it just says, in some sense, the shift in income distribution may passively have allowed bubbles to continue, bubbles that would otherwise have been burst. If you did not have the weakening of aggregate demand, then if a bubble developed, you would tend to get overheating, and you would get the Fed or somebody else stepping in and trying to burst the bubble. It would have been an issue. It would have created inflation. But now it does not create inflation. It does not lead to overheating, so the bubble may be allowed to develop further than otherwise would have been the case. I think this far is fairly standard and fairly obvious, and I have no problems with that, and you can formalize it if you want. But you could ask, are there perhaps any direct links from increasing inequality to the development of financial bubbles? And I think the answer to that is also yes. How strong are they? How important have they been empirically? Well, I don't quite know, but let me give you one example of a mechanism that could easily explain, in this case, the stock market bubble boom that took place in the 90s. That starts from the simple observation that rich and poor households differ not just in their saving rates. They also differ in their portfolio composition. Rich households tend to hold a lot more of their wealth in stocks. Poor households tend to have no stocks or very little stocks. Instead, they have housing or maybe bonds and cash. That's something we all know. I mean, it's not a surprise, but you can check it. And you can check it by going to the Survey of Consumer Finance. Is that what it's called? And I did that. And this is actually, there's a new one out. This is from 2001. I don't know. I did this before the latest one came out, but the pattern would be the same. This is for households where the head of the household is between 55 and 64. I did that because if you look at very young households, they don't really have much wealth. So you want to look at somebody who is up where they have accumulated some kind of wealth, presumably. And if you then split up and you look at relatively poor households that have net worth between $10,000 and $100,000, you find, as we would expect, that the mean household in that bracket has 0% in stocks. The mean is a little bit higher because there are some who have, but the median is 0. Right? Whereas if you go to the rich households with net worth above 1 million, then you find that they have sort of about 1/3 of their wealth in stocks. What does that suggest? That suggests that we can now have a potential bubble mechanism. Right? You shift income to the rich. That leads to a rising demand for stocks. The demand for stocks has no, firms don't automatically issue new stocks. In fact, they've been buying back over the last 20 years. So we have this rising demand for stocks, and you have an inelastic supply of stocks. That means capital gains, stock prices go up. That means the people who buy stocks now have a high return because now they have been getting these capital gains. And if that seems to be going on for a little while, then people would say, oh, stocks is the way to go. You would shift portfolios into the stock market, which then provides the feedback loop, the kind of Minskian feedback loop, that now people shift a greater proportion of their portfolio into stocks. That creates more capital gains, and you have the potential for the bubble starting in this manner. Again, I think that's a fairly plausible story. It builds on some observations about actual behavior in terms of both saving and portfolio composition. If you want to examine the logic, you need to set up a model that has at least 2 financial assets, because you need to have equity stocks and you need to have some cash, some non-equity. You need to have at least 2 types of households. You need to have some rich and some poor. And you need to put in a stylized way, the behavioral differences that we talked about. So the rich have a high saving rate, and they have both equity and money deposits in their portfolio. The poor have a low saving rate, and whatever wealth they have in bank deposits. That would be the structure of the model. And onto that, you now need to sort of add, yes?
May I ask, how could we microfound the, maybe to do with preferences, the difference in the portfolio composition between the 2 type of households? And then secondly, could there be, maybe you try this, a general equilibrium effect of the lower marginal propensity to consume of the richer households, leading somehow there to be greater availability of capital in the system that then could be lent out, for example? But these are 2 questions.
I mean, the micro-founding, I'm sure you can write up stories and you could have just that, but if you have very little wealth, maybe you're risk averse, there could be greater trading costs, and there could be various micro-founding. For present purposes, I'm happy just to take it as a stylized fact, because this is not what I'm really after. Is it important? I guess it could be important how the micro-foundation, to the extent that you think the micro-foundation would shed light on how they would react to, for instance, increases in stock market prices. I will, for present purposes, I will skip that micro-foundation, and I will make the assumption that in some sense, expected returns are expectations about future return are based in large part on what has been observed recently. So in that sense, there's kind of an adaptive rather than a rational expectation. There's no fundamentals driving it. Some people could be fundamentalists, but there is a large element of adaptiveness, of just backward looking. You have seen, I think that's borne out. I think when you talk, people got into the housing market. Everybody thought they were going to keep rising, right? How many people do you know who talked about this and said, oh, they should get in? The same with I think, the stock market boom. I certainly remember talking to a good friend of mine. If this is broadcast, I shouldn't make names. Close to the peak of the bubble, and he was gung ho. Oh, he was going to move more into. He was going to take out loans in his house so he could really get the high return. I said, oh, hold it, don't do it. I think as a matter of fact, this is what happens, and that's what's built into the model. What was the other question you had? Oh, the interactions. This is deliberately a sort of completely sanitized model, in the sense that I will not go to the feedbacks that could exist from aggregate demand to investment to cycles to instability on the real side. I want to look at just the bubble dynamics. Is that reasonable? No, in some ways, I would like to embed it in something richer, but then things do get very complicated. And I thought it would be a good start to have just the bubble. So I'm deliberately sort of making everything else as simple as possible. Firms don't issue equity. There's a constant profit share. There's a constant retention rate in firms. And output grows at a constant rate. So I'm not allowing feedback effects to aggregate demand. I'm assuming aggregate demand, through policy, whatever, is kept running at full employment. Right? I'm just looking at the bubble. Right? And then and this is aside from the portfolio shift and the saving propensities, the other important element is that you get this adaptive kind of change in portfolio composition. That the share of equity in the portfolios of the rich would respond gradually to changes in relative returns.
Doesn't that have
Yes.
to happen if they already own the shares and they have a positive return, don't they have to increase as a share of the market portfolio? Unless there's someone exogenous to the model to sell the stock.
Well, yeah, in some sense, the capital gains and the market valuation would depend on how much they want to put into. That's endogenous, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Maybe that's what you're saying.
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is precisely what is produced by their behavior. I have $100 here cash. I want to have. And I have one share, right? And I want to have half my wealth in shares, right? So I now, if the current share price, I had one share. If the current share price is 50, I say, oh, I should buy more shares. And as we all want to do it, and nobody is selling, then we bid up the share price to 100, and I haven't spent any money. So my wealth adjusts. Is that what you're?
Right. So then mechanically, it has to be a larger portion of your portfolio.
But what comes first is the behavior. It's not the capital gain that generates you.
Right. Of
what?
course.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So again, you formalize this, and this is just very simple equations that match what I told you about different saving rates and portfolio compositions. Budget constraints. And then you have the portfolio dynamics, that you have expected returns, and you have the desired portfolio share alpha. Alpha is the proportion of the rich's wealth that they want to hold in equity, and that changes gradually in response to whatever is the expected return on equity. And you have the expected return on equity that responds to what has actual return been. So it adjusts upward. These are these adaptive processes I talked about. What you get is now a three-dimensional system. And the interesting bit, maybe, what I thought was interesting, I didn't know before, is that you get in this system, you get corridor stability. What do I mean? In this system, what I do is I start out at a steady growth path, at a stationary point. And then I say, let's now shift income to the rich. So I take some income from the poor, give it to the rich. And I find that if this shift is small, then you may get some dynamics, some fluctuations, but you get back to the same stationary state. Or a new stationary state. Some variables are unchanged, but some have changed, obviously. But it gets back to a stationary state. But if I give it a large shock, if there's a big increase in inequality, then all of a sudden you do not get convergence back. You get corridor stability. Small displacements do not lead to instability, but big ones do. And I have some simulations here. This is a 3D system, so I projected down in a 2-dimensional. I can't read these 3D pictures that people sometimes produce. So I projected down this 3D dynamics in 2 dimensions. Here it's the expected rate of return on equity and the portfolio share alpha. And you start out in the stationary point. I've now shifted. I've given an increase in income to the rich, and you get now fluctuations. And this here is an increase that's just big enough to bring you into the unstable region. You spiral out, and then it looks as if you're almost going to get stuck there, and then eventually you break free and you diverge. If I had given a smaller initial shock to inequality, then again you get the cycles, but now they converge back. You get stability. So this is the corridor instability. Small shocks to inequality did not produce the instability, but large shocks did. Or the ultimate explosion. Yeah. And then you can make it so unstable that the shock is big enough. Now, this is not the only mechanism that can produce bubbles. Is it the most important one? I don't know. But it's an indication that there are links, and I think this is one link that exists because portfolios do differ. Other possible stories, include Veblen effects. Right? If you have, and that may be more relevant if we're talking not the 90s and the stock market boom, but the housing boom. If you get inequality increasing and you have people trying to keep up with the Joneses, and if you then get the financial system becoming lax in its willingness to give loans to low-income people that are risky, then you can get instability as a result of this. My income has dropped relative to everybody else, but I want to try to keep up, so I'm willing to go out and borrow money, and if the system lets me, we can get financial instability coming out that way. Some people have been playing with that, and I think that may be just as important. So again, I was not giving you the other example as this is the only story. I was just giving it as a simple example of how some of these inequality processes, whether they come from skill bias technical change or from power bias technical change or from induced mismatch, whatever the background, are likely to have implications for the macro performance and potentially have been important also in, as something that has contributed to financial instability. Yes.
I was wondering to what extent it is also important the role of monetary policy. Some countries use inflation targeting, and that might also develop general monetary policy.
Monetary policy, obviously. I mean, I put that if you have weakness of relative demand, and you respond to that by pushing interest rate down and trying to promote more aggressive lending, then there's your potential starting point, and that undoubtedly played a role. I'm tempted to say we should stop, because I would love to have some comments. Can we go a few minutes over if we want?
I think so. Like, the dinner is only at 7 at the moment. I don't know when the shuttle will take us there, but I don't think that the shuttle will go at 5. So we can do a little longer than 5. So
maybe I'll sort of just give you a couple of points here and then stop, but make it very quick. The point of this is that if you look at not just the US, which many people are doing, certainly in the US, but also elsewhere in the world, then it looks like we have this pattern that just has to be explained, and this is the only possible pattern, and it involves increasing inequality. But if you look at international evidence, and of course both the levels and changes in inequality and the sources of the change in inequality are quite different, as are the institutions that characterize different countries. And the institutional differences may play an important role in understanding these differences, which goes back to some of the stuff I was trying to say earlier, that institutions do matter. And that's the sort of hopeful sign. It's not just a matter of technology. Institutions can make a difference to inequality outcomes. This is from the OECD, just showing differences in Gini coefficients. And you see that they range very widely, and that the arrows show how much they have increased between 85 and 2008. And you see that there are even a couple of countries where inequality has decreased, and there are some of the countries where the increase has been much smaller than it has in the Anglo-Saxon countries. Then the sources are different. You can look at here the trends in annual hours worked by the bottom and top quintiles, and what you see is that where's the U.S.? The U.S. is here. The U.S. has seen the bottom actually working more. So you have the bottom quintile putting in a lot of hours, whereas in some of the other countries, the bottom has now put in fewer hours. So the labor, the employment that lies behind the income inequality, the employment pattern is very different across countries. The employment pattern that we see in the U.S., the change there is not at all what we find in other countries. You see the contribution of capital income to total household income at different quintiles, again, is very different. In the US, which is over here, the top quintile, the contribution of capital income has been decreasing. That's precisely, it's like earnings, it's wages that now play an increasing role. But if you look at the increasing inequality in places like Norway, Finland, Denmark, where the increase has been much smaller, then capital income has been much more important. So there's a diversity in what has been both the extent to which you have increasing inequality, but also the mechanisms behind. And then, perhaps most importantly, income redistribution of various kinds make an enormous difference. You have here the blue bars would be the Gini for the market income, and then you have for the disposable income the darker. And you see that some countries actually redistribute a lot and do it successfully, bring down the Ginis very substantially compared to the market outcome. The standard argument against that would be, oh, if you try to do that, you get all of these disincentive effects, and that's bad for income and growth and all that. I think one should be very skeptical about that. Some of the countries that redistribute a lot are quite successful Scandinavian countries, where you get huge redistribution, and they have, both in terms of growth rates and levels of income and the proportion of people participating in the labor market, they've been doing quite well. So we have not seen these disincentive effects. Economists have been looking for them. And I came across this paper that I've been citing. These are former colleagues of mine from University of Aarhus in Denmark. Very nice people, Peter Pedersen and Nina Smith. And they went out. They're good economists. They went out. We have very good data in Denmark, and they went out saying, oh, there must be disincentive effects, right? So they wrote this paper in which they sort of, in the abstract, they talk about having found disincentive effects. And they do find some. They do find something that could be interpreted as disincentive effects. But here's a table. This is from a paper that's trying to show that disincentive effects matter. Right? They have a table here that show the share of employed and unemployed workers in percent who are in an unemployment trap. That means that they actually, after taking into account expenses associated with working, they actually end up with lower income than they would have had if they'd just been unemployed. Now, if you believe that incentive effects were very important for labor supply and for performance, then you would expect to see what? You'd expect to see that for the employed, you would find employed men, or women for that matter, should have a zero here, right? You're only employed because you do better, right? You should not be in an employment trap. And you would expect to see that the unemployed, many of them would maybe choose to be unemployed because they couldn't do better by being in the labor market. And what you see from this very good data, that basically is exactly the same. If there's ever was evidence of the unimportance of incentives for labor market participation, then it seems to me that is it. As I said, they go on the paper and they find some evidence that I think it was women sort of tend to retire earlier if they are in unemployment traps, which could be explained by the fact that many of these jobs that they would have are, hard physical jobs. They're actually, pretty much worn down by 60. So there could be other explanations for that. But the main point I want to make is just that if you look outside the US context, then this argument that redistribution would just hurt us enormously in terms of disincentives to work and lower growth rates and whatnot, I don't see much evidence for it. I think you need to have the faith. If you look for it, you can find small disincentive effects, but in general, I would tend to discount it, which is good news, because that means if only we could get the political consensus, maybe we could actually do something. What have I tried to do? I've tried to say, in terms of explanations, the TINA argument, the argument that, hey, to make sense of the combination of wage inequality and employment patterns that we see, then it must have been skill bias technical change. That argument, I think, is just logically false. I think there are, call it Marxian and institutionalist stories of increasing inequality that can explain or are consistent with the evidence. By the Marxian, I mean this kind of power bias technical change, which feeds in or builds on it, if you want, old Marxian stories about the extraction of labor power. And then I think there are links between inequality and macro performance. And I've only sketched one possible, but I think this is important to bear in mind, that these inequality trends are intrinsically enormously important, and that's kind of the main reason to look at them maybe. But they're also important for macro issues. The prospects, well, it's important, I think, to recognize that whatever policy solutions you come up with depend on your diagnosis of what are the causes. If you believe that skill bias technical change is what matters, then you say education. But if it's really not a matter of skill bias technical change, but instead a matter of power bias or induced mismatch, then education is not the solution. I've also tried to argue that it's a false trade-off. It is not, as some people would say, a trade-off where you can have inequality and full employment, or you can try to create equality, but that's going to be costly in terms of unemployment. There's no foundation for that trade-off, neither in the theories, nor for that matter in the empirical evidence. We have countries with very equal distribution of incomes and very high employment rates, and they're not growing slowly. It's not as if we look at the empirical evidence, then overwhelmingly it says, oh, well, yes, theoretically you can come up with these stories, but if the evidence, no, the evidence does not show that there's a trade-off of that kind. International evidence, institutions do matter, and redistribution does work if only one can get the political backing, and that's where maybe the biggest questions in my mind are to get a political backing for institutional solutions that could address inequality. I think both the power bias technical change argument I gave you, where there may in the past have been some interest from big business in having the New Deal institutions, and that may not be present today, and also the globalization issues may make it harder to create that consensus. Yeah, skip that. Oh, this is about this in the U.S. context about creating this political consensus. It's striking, as I'm sure most of you are aware, that views differ between the U.S. and many other countries. In the U.S., despite high inequality and despite less mobility intergenerationally than in many other countries, it's not the case that the U.S. has high mobility. We have income inequality on the first axis, we have intergenerational mobility, or immobility rather, on a higher number on the vertical axis means less mobility. And of course the US is way above many European countries, both in terms of inequality and in terms of mobility. But despite that, perceptions in the US are much more than in Europe that, hey, it doesn't matter what your background is, you get rewarded for skill, you get rewarded for working hard and for intelligence. Coming from a wealthy family is not essential, people say. Income differences are too large. People disagree in the US, or don't agree as much in the US as they do elsewhere. Government has a responsibility. In the US, people disagree much more. So this sort of goes to the question of creating a political consensus, which in the US maybe is going to be difficult. Although one could hope, and we can also see this slide as maybe providing hope, as it becomes more and more apparent that some of these beliefs are false, maybe that's going to change the prospects for change. Who knows? Thank you, and sorry that I have been too long-winded here, perhaps. We still have time for questions or for comments, Enno tells me.
Yes, I hear now that the shuttle will leave at 6:15. No, 5:15. 5:15. I'm getting confused because of the time there.
So does that mean we don't have time?
Yeah, we have now 10 minutes or so.
10 minutes.
We should go to the shuttle.
Okay.
What's the rest? In the Waterloo Inn.
At 7. And we move at 5:15.
Yeah, the shuttle brings us to the hotel, and then there's another shuttle to the dinner.
You know more than I do.
Okay. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I was wondering about the education solution, because according to the mismatch story, higher education increases inequality, but for the individual, it's still optimal to get that education, right? Because you get a high-skilled job, maybe.
Maybe, yeah. No, absolutely. But this is, I mean, that's a good question, actually, because you could say, hey, well, if there always this mismatch, why do people then bother getting education? But it's still individually rational. I mean, we saw that the average wage of college graduates in the model as well goes up. So you don't know whether you're going to end up with a good or a bad job, but your expected income is higher if you do the college. So there's nothing on the kind of demand for education side that automatically would reduce the investment in education. That's
if inequality gets so high that we cannot afford education.
That's
Just a quick observation. I mean, I found the evidence you had that the incentive system does really work when it comes to working class.
sorry, that what?
The proportion of people in unemployment traps. That was quite interesting. And then I thought a bit about it. Essentially, maybe what you should do to make it even more convincing. I mean, it's the proportions of employed and unemployed people who are in unemployment traps. It's almost the same. But since of course the proportion of employed is far larger than the proportion of unemployed. If you would just do the numbers, you then see that actually of the people in an unemployment trap, 80–90% of them must be employed.
Yes, yes, you're right. Yeah. Part of what's going on, I should say, it may be that although Denmark has very or relatively generous social benefits, unemployment benefits, there also is a strong attempt to, you get activated. If you're unemployed, you get, and you can view that, of course, as from a positive angle. Hey, if you've been out of work, we'll try to, improve your education. We'll try to give you job offers. But the other side of that is, if you start refusing that, you may become disqualified from some benefits. So part of it is that you may have to, or that could be part of it.
I have a question about the mismatch data. A lot of it is general about like college educated, but what about if we looked at engineers, nurses, accountants? Would they see the same kind of occupational mismatch that other college graduates might see?
Did I mention that I used to have, instead of the business week from this year, I used to have, when I gave similar talk last year, I had something from New York Times from a year ago or maybe 2 years ago. That started out with a picture of Mr. Carroll, I think his name was, who was an accountant and who had been in some, I don't know what he'd been, some high-ranking accounting position in some firm, had got laid off, and now got into a job that was still about numbers, but was much lower level, more of a bookkeeper kind of, I've forgotten what the title was. So it was definitely a kind of, he was now overqualified. He did not go into, I mean, being overqualified does not mean, most of the people who are overqualified do not go straight to flipping burgers at McDonald's, right? They move down a few rungs to a job that may still be related to their skills, but perhaps does not require the full education they have. So I think the answer is yes. And nurses, I don't know whether, but accountants certainly.
No, I'm just thinking that then more people are getting educated, but if more people get educated in not to pick on anyone, so let's say more people get educated in basket weaving, then it's not necessarily skills that have anything to do with the
That's
marketplace.
true. That's true.
But it's more of a signal that this is a hardworking, smart person who can sit for 4 years through classes, and I'd rather hire him than someone who only has a high school education.
I think you're right. I think you're right, and I think that is another weakness of some of the data, that of course you can't measure skill just by looking at years of education. There are clearly some kinds of education that may have a bigger demand than others, and so that's a good point, and that would be part of it. I don't think it's all of it, but that would be part of it.
Can I make a small point on this? The kind of professions you've got in mind, the kind of degrees, educational degrees, don't really fit this because entry is extremely restricted. So typically you wouldn't find doctors who've graduated who are underemployed because medical schools are just tiny, right? And engineers is pretty much the same. So for example, in the UK, now you can actually find most of these statistics, they're called college jobs or something, or graduate jobs. They're now publicly available across universities, and you can see that some faculties have very small percentage, tiny percentage of people who go into poor jobs or low tech or underqualified. But that's precisely because, I mean, the medical school in my university is 30 people, 50 people, whereas business management is 300 undergrads every year. And that's a huge difference. And the Bank of Italy released a report on this, I think last week, and the percentage of people who get graduate jobs after a BAc is ridiculous. It's something like 35%, 30%. It was nothing. I mean, it's a huge percentage of people who are either unemployed or totally underemployed.
On your database, do you have any information of who are these overqualified people in terms of the socioeconomic background? Because of course they'll kind of determine what kind of higher education they will get, what institution they go to.
I don't think we have that. I don't think we have that in the database. It's a good question. I will.
Because
I will.
There's a lot of research of how socioeconomic background, lower socioeconomic background, they kind of overestimate the costs and underestimate the benefits. And the more traditional explanation is asymmetric information, but really is an issue of discrimination in the labor market, or also quality of higher education that you get. So it would be interesting to look at the data.
I don't know that data is available in the data sets that we looked at, but it's a good point, and something I'll ask Fabian to look at. He'll be delighted.
The shuttle is already there, and we have basically 3 groups, like this course, the other course, and a research program meeting that are going to take that shuttle. I don't know, I mean, maybe the others are doing also overtime, but maybe not. So I think we have to finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, and I hope we'll get a chance to discuss some of this if you're interested over the next couple of days.